So we now understand that evidence must be relevant to be admissible. But how do we know whether a piece of evidence is relevant? Well, fortunately for us, the Federal Rules of Evidence define relevance, and they define relevance in Rule 401. Evidence is relevant if A, it has any tendency to make a fact more or less probable than it would be without the evidence, and B, the fact is of consequence in determining the action. Now, in this video, we're only going to be talking about Part A, the first part of the rule. And the first part of this rule says that for evidence to be relevant, it has to have some tendency to make a fact more or less probable than it would be without the evidence. More or less probable. And probable here just means likely to be true. So for evidence to be relevant, it has to have a tendency to make a fact more or less likely to be true. Now the words more or less, let me underline that too. Those words, more or less, they don't mean more or less in the way that we sometimes use those words as an expression. Like if someone were to ask you, did you do your homework? And you say, yeah, more or less. Well, in that case, when you say more or less, you mean, well, not exactly, or not completely, but pretty much. Okay? That's not what more or less means here. Here, it's not an expression. Okay? More or less in Rule 401 is not an expression. It doesn't mean pretty much. It means more or less. Okay, so let's write that down here. More or less, in the context of this rule here, this definition of relevance, more or less does not mean the expression pretty much. Right, what it actually means is more or less, either more or less. All right, so either more probable or less probable. In other words, the evidence makes some fact either more likely to be true or less likely to be true. All right, so let's look at some examples. Let's say that we have, let's say there was a bank robbery one day. All right, so let's draw that out. I always think it's kind of easier to understand if we can see it. Okay, so here's our bank. All right, let's give it a roof. All right, so here's our bank. And there was a bank robbery one day. All right, and so let's draw our bank robber. Okay, so here's our bank robber running away from the scene of the crime, and he's holding a gun in one hand and a bag of money in the other hand. All right, bags of money in these cartoons always have a dollar sign on it, so I'll draw that on my in my drawing here too. Okay, so here's our robber running away from the bank. And what we want to know is whether the defendant was the one who did it. Okay, so there's a defendant on trial, and what we want to know is whether the defendant was in fact the bank robber. All right, now let's say that the defendant owns a white car, and there's a witness for the prosecution who testifies that she saw the robber drive away in a white car. All right, so this robber here got into a white car. That's my car here. All right, and drove away. All right, that looks kind of funny. Let's color that in. All right, so here's our white car that the robber drove away in, and there's a witness for the prosecution who says that she saw the robber drive away in a white car. So the getaway vehicle was a white car, and we know that the defendant owns a white car. All right, now based on that witness testimony, does that mean that the defendant is definitely the one who robbed the bank? Well, of course not. Right? It doesn't even mean that the defendant probably robbed the bank. I mean, just because the witness saw the robber drive away in a white car doesn't mean that it was the defendant's car. I mean, there are lots of white cars. So that evidence is not definitive. All right? But let's look at the definition of relevant. The first part of this rule for relevance, right, this first part of the definition, it says that for evidence to be relevant, it just needs to have any tendency. Let's underline that. Any tendency to make a fact more probable or less probable. So if the defendant owns a white car and the robber's getaway vehicle is a white car, well, that makes it at least slightly more likely that the defendant is the one who committed the robbery. Okay, so you can think of it, you can think about it like this. If you needed to decide whether the defendant was the robber, all right, and let's say after hearing all of the testimony, all of the evidence, the police report, the security camera footage, eyewitness testimony, I already said that, all right, physical evidence, you name it. After all of that, if you're split 50-50 on whether the defendant is the one who robbed the bank. All right, you're split exactly 50-50. I mean, it's a true coin flip. You really feel like the evidence for and against the defendant are perfectly balanced. Right? If that were the case, and then the witness testified that she saw the robber drive away in a white car, and we know that the defendant owns a white car, with that testimony, would it nudge you one way or the other in your decision, even just the tiniest bit? If so, that means that the testimony does have at least some tendency, it does have any tendency to make it more or less likely that the defendant robbed the bank. Now remember, the key here is any tendency. Any tendency. Evidence doesn't have to definitively prove that a fact is true or not true. It doesn't even have to strongly suggest that the fact is true or not true. It just needs to have any tendency to nudge the fact finder one way or the other. And in this case, I think the testimony about the white car makes it ever so slightly more likely that the defendant did it. So the witness's testimony about the white car, right, that satisfies the first part of this definition of relevance. Okay, so let's do another example. Let's say that the defendant produces a hospital record. All right, so here's my hospital record, and well, it says hospital on it. All right, there's a hospital record that says that the defendant, let's say, was having chest pains on the day of the bank robbery. So he went to the emergency room, and the hospital record shows when he checked into the hospital and when he was discharged from the hospital. And let's say that he checked in the morning on the day of the robbery at 6 a.m., so very early in the morning, and he was discharged at 11 p.m., very late at night. All right? Okay, so now he has some evidence that suggests that it couldn't have been him. He couldn't have been the one that robbed the bank because he was in the hospital all day. But does this hospital record, does it definitively prove that he didn't rob the bank? Well, no. Maybe he snuck out of the hospital for a few minutes to go rob the bank, right? Or maybe the records are just wrong about what time he checked in or checked out. Okay? But because the rule only requires some tendency, any tendency to make the fact of him robbing the bank more or less probable, I think that a record showing that the defendant was in the hospital all day, that makes it at least somewhat less likely that he robbed the bank. So the hospital record would satisfy this first part of the definition of relevance. Okay, now just a couple of special points about this any tendency stuff. All right, now first of all, well, let's draw a little line here and write these notes down here. Okay. The first thing I want you to notice is that the hospital records showing that the defendant was in the hospital all day, well, that's probably a more persuasive piece of evidence than the testimony about the car, right? The testimony from the witness who just said that she saw the robber drive away in a white car. But remember how we talked about how evidence nudging us one way or the other in making a decision, that it just has to nudge us just the slightest bit? Well, here, the hospital records will probably nudge us a bit more than the testimony about the white car. That's true, but that doesn't mean that the testimony about the white car is less relevant than the hospital records. See, whether evidence is relevant is a yes or no question. It either is relevant or is not relevant. Relevance is yes or no, right? It isn't a little relevant or very relevant or more relevant or less relevant. It's either relevant or not relevant. It's kind of like how a light switch is either on or off. Okay, it isn't very on or less on. It's just on or off. Now, some lights might be brighter than others, but we don't say that those lights are very on. They're still just on. Okay, so likewise, please make sure you understand that evidence is either relevant or not relevant. And the standard, according to the first part of this definition, the standard is any tendency to make a fact more or less likely to be true. Right? It might be more persuasive, it might not be that persuasive, but as long as it has any tendency to make a fact more or less likely to be true, it satisfies this part of the definition, and so the evidence can be relevant, regardless of how big or how small that tendency is. Right? As long as it has any tendency. All right, so that's the first little special point. The second thing that I want to point out is about this any tendency. See, any tendency here doesn't just refer to how strongly the evidence nudges us one way or the other. these words, any tendency, they also refer to how the evidence might nudge us. Okay, so any tendency, it doesn't have to directly show some fact. It doesn't have to directly show that a fact is more or less probable. It can also do it indirectly. Just as long as it logically has some tendency to make the fact more or less likely to be true, then that evidence could be relevant. See, the examples that we've looked at so far, the hospital records and the testimony about the white car, neither one of those directly says, I saw him do it, or I saw the person who did do it and it wasn't him. Right? That would be direct evidence. These pieces of evidence, these examples, they just relate to whether the defendant might have been at the scene of the crime, right? Whether he had an opportunity to commit the crime. Opportunity. All right? But even that, whether or not he had an opportunity to commit the crime, that does have some tendency to show that he did or didn't do it. And that's because logically, let's consider the hospital record, for example. Logically, if he couldn't have been there because he was in the hospital all day, well, that makes it less likely that he did it. But on the other hand, if it seems like he was there, or at least that his car was there, it's at least slightly more likely that he did it. Okay, so it doesn't have to be, the evidence doesn't have to be direct evidence. It can be indirect evidence as long as it somehow logically suggests that, it logically makes it more or less likely to be true, at least in some small way. All right, now similarly, evidence that the defendant, let's say, had a motive to commit the crime. That could also be relevant evidence. Right? Say our defendant here, say he was in a great deal of debt and he needed a lot of money fast. Okay? That doesn't directly say I saw him do it, but it does logically have some tendency to make it more likely that he did it. All right? And evidence can even be relevant by questioning the reliability of other evidence. Okay? The reliability of other evidence. Let's say, for example, that the testimony about the white car, right? Let's say that after the witness testified that she saw the robber get into a white car, the defense introduced a DMV record showing that the witness is actually legally blind. All right? Well, that would certainly cast some doubt on the reliability of her testimony. Okay? If what the witness saw had previously nudged us toward believing that the defendant was the one who did it, well, then evidence that that witness is legally blind, well, that would probably nudge us back the other way. Okay? So that means that the DMV record would have a tendency to make it less likely that the defendant did it. Again, not direct evidence, but indirectly it suggests, it has a tendency to make a fact more or less probable. In this case, less probable that the defendant was the one who did it. Okay, so let's review. For evidence to be relevant, it needs to have some tendency to make a fact more likely to be true or less likely to be true. But that tendency doesn't have to be very strong. Any tendency to nudge us one way or the other in believing whether a fact is true or not true, well, that's enough. And the tendency can come from pretty much anything that would logically make us think that the fact is more likely to be true or less likely to be true. It could be direct evidence. It could be evidence that directly says that the fact is true or not true, but it certainly doesn't have to be. It could be evidence, for example, that relates to opportunity. Right? These are just examples. Let's make that a little bit neater. For example, opportunity, motive, or even reliability of other evidence, or anything else for that matter that would logically nudge us. Okay, let's put ... It could be other things. Something that would logically nudge us one way or the other in deciding whether the fact is true or not true.